now be listening to Amitava's wisdom here in public.
In public? Peut-être. I'll keep this here.
I've been talking for last 5 minutes, Director, Madam DG, beautiful flower decoration.
Very good.
Good afternoon, esteemed guest. Before we proceed, I kindly request you to switch off your phone or put them on flight mode. I welcome you all to today's event, Book Discussion on the Indentured and Their Route by Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee. The program is as follows. Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, will give her welcome remarks. This will be followed by presentation on about the book by the author, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, former permanent representative of India to UNESCO and former ambassador to the Netherlands, and currently the president of India Habitat Center. Thereafter, remarks by panelists, Ambassador Amitava Tripathi, former ambassador of India to Switzerland and Brazil, followed by remarks by Ambassador Veena Sikri, former Indian High Commissioner in Bangladesh and Malaysia, and then remarks by Ambassador Skand Tayal, former ambassador of India to Republic of Korea and Uzbekistan. We shall then have a question and answer session moderated by the Chair, DG ICWA. May I request Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, DG ICWA, to kindly give her welcome remarks.
Good afternoon. I am very, very delighted to welcome to the Indian Council of World Affairs all the distinguished guests, in particular Ambassador Amitava Tripathi, Ambassador Veena Sikri, Ambassador Skand Tayal, for a discussion on the book, The Indentured and Their Route, authored by Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, who was the permanent representative of India to UNESCO and our ambassador to the Netherlands. And all of them are my seniors, so for me, it is a great honor to have them in Sapro House, along with my other seniors, Ambassador Dogra, Ambassador Surendra, Ambassador, my dear, dear friend, Ambassador Suresh Goyal. So migration. Migration is a vertical on which the Indian Council of World Affairs has been working on since 2022. This was when the Indian Center for Migration, which was with the MEA, was merged with ICWA. And since then, it has been one of the major verticals of research in ICWA. But what is happening is that our researchers are largely focused on looking at contemporary debates and trends in the international migration scenario. And also given the fact that today you have the Indian community, diaspora, almost in every country in the world. However, to fully understand the experiences of the diaspora, it needs necessarily to go back to in history to be able to understand how the waves of migration took place out of India. And indentured labor migration from India, which is a theme of this book, is very relevant in understanding that history and the study of migration. But history often tends to neglect the narratives of the impoverished. Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee's book is an extensive historical analysis of the indentured labor route, and it brings into the conversations, in the contemporary conversation, of that wave of migration. We do know that following the abolition of slavery in 1833, the indentured labor system, which was actually the great experiment of the British, they introduced it so that they could get their labor force into their colonies. And under this great experiment, the scheme, they recruited approximately 2 million from pre-independent India by enticing them through agreements which incorporated issues such like wages, food, and accommodation. Of course, none of them were really adhered to, but nevertheless, it was these kind of agreements that were worked out, And armed with these agreements, which were called girmit in the local language, they set off on the sea to various countries in the continents of Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. And they traveled in the most difficult and pathetic conditions, and when they arrived to work in plantations, they were faced with very severe working conditions. The practice of girmit was abolished in 1917, but today, as we are discussing Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee's book, it is coincidental that the President of India, President Murmu, is visiting Mauritius, where the Pravasi Ghat stands as a memorial to the arrival of the first Indian indentured labor in Mauritius. Ambassador's book meticulously documents the origin of the indentured, the stories of the girmitias longing to return home, the trials and the tribulations of the indentured women labor. Secondly, the book undertakes a critical analysis and brings to the fore the important role that memory plays in historical narratives. It showcases at one level the resilience and adaptability of the indentured labor as they navigated and contributed to their new societies, but yet at the same time retaining the memories of their motherland. The enduring presence of the Bhojpuri language and cultural practices in countries like Mauritius, Guyana, Suriname serve as a testament to the lasting impact of the indentured labor. These traditions have been preserved even 180 years and beyond in these countries and serve as a pillar for strengthening our bilateral relations between India and these countries. On the contemporary migration studies and on contemporary migration, India has moved away from the narratives of the colonial exploitation by the colonizers to promoting the welfare, the safety, and the security of Indians overseas through pathways of cooperation with other countries. This is evidenced in the signing of the Migration, Mobility, and Partnership Agreements and the social protection agreements that India is concluding with key destination countries in Europe, Asia, and the Gulf. In conclusion, I would like to thank Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee for a very invaluable contribution to diaspora studies and invite her to introduce the book, The Indentured and Their Root, a book which is an outcome of a dedicated work as permanent representative of India to UNESCO and India's representative to the World Heritage Committee on the Indentured Root projects. Master Bhaswati.
Thank you so much, Vijay. And first of all, I would like to thank the panelists who are all dear friends of mine. I'll begin with my batchmate, Skand Tayal, Ambassador Skand Tayal, and my two dear friends seated here, Ambassador Veena Sikri and Ambassador Amitava Tripathi, and to thank Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh for having organized this, and to see many friends of mine in the audience, including Ambassador Rajiv Dogra, who abandoned his golf at my behest to come to be with us today, and Ambassador Surendra Kumar, and so many others whom I can see sitting around, and Ambassador Suresh Goyal, of course, who's come all the way from Greater Noida. So thank you so much for that, Suresh. To introduce the book, my first task would be to explain why I wrote the book. I wrote the book for a very simple reason. I'm a student of history, and therefore a lot of Indian history is known to me, which is not known to many Indians of my generation, and certainly not known to Indians in the generations after me. As Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh said, I was India's representative on the World Heritage Committee when I was permanent rep in UNESCO. And I went to a place called Lithuania in 2007, where the Mauritians had brought what they considered to be an extremely important site called Pravasi Ghat, which was intended for the world never to forget how the indentured were treated, how they were a substitute for slavery, how 1.5 million Indians constituting a formidable labor force were taken away from India, thereby ensuring that India, which was on the cusp of an industrial revolution in 1757, was left impoverished, bleeding, and divided when the Brits finally left in 1947. When the site came up for introduction, the representative of ICWA, who was supposed to introduce the title, an English woman called Suzanne, and it would come as no surprise to you that Bongs are very emotional people. For some strange reason, I took an immediate dislike to this Susan. And as she continued to describe Apravasi Ghat, saying that India was a miserable country, desolate, poor, starving, famine-stricken, and that the British colonial government in its generosity decided to create employment for all these miserable Indians living in India. And Apravasi Ghat should be called immigration depot and should be given the same status as the Silicon Valley gives now to the hundreds and thousands of talented engineers, IT technicians, etc., who go there. What is the difference, she asked the audience, between that kind of immigration and now? Because both were to ensure that these poor citizens of a terrible country did not die of starvation, were given a way out. At that point of time, Minister Mukesh Choni, Minister of Culture, who's praised the book, who was here last week, he sent me a chit saying, Africa explains slavery and its horrors much better than indenture. So can the Indian ambassador explain the horrors of indenture? It is then that I explained to them how indenture came, how the sugar plantations fell silent, how there was no labor force, and therefore, in the devious colonial mind was born the synonym of slavery, which was indenture, which is why in my book I say there are two parts of the same colonial coin, the black slave on one side of the coin and the brown indenture on the other. And to make sure that they leave behind a divisive legacy, they also ensured that the brown indenture and the black slave, particularly in countries where the black slaves were in large numbers, for example, Fiji, they would remain perpetually divided by introducing a system of social apartheid by which the slaves were told the Indians are lazy and cannot work, and the Indians were told these black people are jungly and should be treated like jungly people. And because of that, they were never allowed to mix, never allowed to intermarry, never allowed any social life, and they grew up side by side, victims of the same system, but learning disharmony and learning not to live with each other. Quite similar to the theme of my last book on partition of Bengal, where I spoke about how the poisoned grapes of communalism was introduced into Bengal by the Brits precisely to ensure divide and rule. After I finished speaking, there were 4 ambassadors who spoke, all white people, all from developed countries, United States, New Zealand, Netherlands, etc. They said they were ashamed of the legacy of slavery, that they were horrified to hear about Apravasi Ghat and how its steps have been hollowed out by the feet of 1.5 million Indians who climbed up those steps not knowing what their future would be, fooled by a contract which was never to be a contract, the agreement with their thumbprints on it, which was never respected, thrown overboard while they were still alive because they were made to drink contaminated, cholera-contaminated water of the river Hooghly, which was used to fill the water tanks of the ships and given to the indentured but not to the white crew. And then the children, the orphans of the Jahaz Bhais and Jahaz Behns, when they came off the ship, they were looked after by the other Jahaz Bhais, Jahaz Behns, and they were called strange names. They asked me in Mauritius. Mukesh Chuni asked me, is there any person in India called Chunni? I said, no. Sarita Buddhu asked me, anyone in India called Buddhu? I said, no. So they said, when they came off, Mukesh Chunni's great-grandfather was thrown overboard. And so when the overseer, who was English, said, what's this child's name? Guy spoke no English. He said, Chunni Munni, little baby. So he was called Chunni. And from that name, Chunni, he became Culture Minister of Mauritius, Ambassador of Mauritius to India, and is today's President of Gopio International. And Sarita Buddhu, who was married to the President of Mauritius, had the same sad story to tell, that her great-grandfather was a very naughty child. So the Jahaz Bhais and Behns used to call him Buddhu, Buddhu, Buddhu. And so the surname became Buddhu. I also wrote in my book about the indentured women, quoting from Amitav Bachchan's poem in Pink, which Surendra Bhai can recite better than me, but he'll have to acknowledge that as a bong, my Hindi is pretty good, because it begins by saying, "Tu khud ki khoj mein nikal, tu kis liye hatash hai, tu chal teri wajud ki bhi talash hai." Your time has come. Women, indentured women, rise. Because indentured women were subjected to two kinds of discrimination. One, of course, by the colonizer, but the other at the hands of the male patriarchy of the country they came from. They were all labeled as prostitutes, loose women. They were raped on the ship. They were raped and they came out of the ship. They were married off to people they didn't want. And then later came the system of child marriage, because the father would sell his daughter to some very old man for money. But still, because in my perspective, and I'm sure all the ladies here would agree with me, women are really the stronger sex. They kept the family together. They controlled their men. They saved money. They built small plots of land. They built the rainbow nations. So, whether it's in Mauritius or Fiji or Union Island or anywhere else, where would the world be without their women folk? That's also a subject matter. And finally, I would like to say that I've also talked about identity and how in one particular place, Reunion Island, the French colonizer practiced a unique form of mental torture called the racinement. The racinement means emptying your head out of all identity, erasing the roots from where you came. No name of village, no name of father, mother, French names given, not allowed to practice religion, not allowed to cook Indian food. But still, even in Reunion Island, in the little plots they have, they grow curry patta. They eat very, very hot food, which frankly is beyond my capacity. They try to wear Indian dress. They want to learn yoga. They want to know about India. And yet they are lost and desolate when they come to India because they speak no language but French. And that is where the Girmithya descendants of Reunion Island, in my perspective, have suffered more than anyone else, because when the Mauritian comes, or the Fijian comes, or Guyana or Suriname, etc., they speak their previous mother tongue, they speak Hindi or Bhojpuri, and they speak whatever is the language of the colonizer. But in Reunion Island, I remember I organized a trip for them to go to Tamil Nadu. They were from Tamil Nadu. And they called me from there and asked me to tell the French embassy to send an interpreter, because they said they're roaming around Chennai and people are stopping and talking to them and then making hands saying, "What are you saying?" Because they speak no Tamil. They were not allowed to speak Tamil. They were not even allowed to speak their mother tongue within the safety of their own house. And this practice, the French have practiced all over Africa. And I realized it when I was ambassador to UNESCO. And a Nobel laureate came from Nigeria for dinner to my place. And I had invited the chairman of the executive board, who was from Benin. And they were speaking a strange language together. And I asked them, "What language are you speaking?" They said, "We are speaking our mother tongue, which the French never allowed us, Yoruba." So in the country that is now Benin, which was part of Nigeria, the Nigerians and the Beninois spoke Yoruba, which was eliminated through the racinement in Benin by the French colonizer. Finally, I wrote about identity because I strongly believe that identity is a raison d'etre for existence. A person who does not know his identity or her identity, doesn't know where he or she comes from, doesn't know which culture or civilization he or she originally came from, and faced with the kind of challenges working on sugar plantations that they had never worked on because they were from the east. There were no sugar plantations at that time in Jharkhand, Bihar and Bengal. And they were not aware that they would never go back. So they clung to identity. For them, identity meant so many things, whether it was the Ramayana or the Quran or a dhoti or a sari. If you go to Mauritius and you go to the museum there, you'll find these little symbols of identity. And why did they matter? They mattered because it made all the difference to them between being connected and one day becoming part of the great Indian diaspora, and on the other, being rootless, having a vague understanding of where they came from, but not even being able to communicate because the other side doesn't speak French. I'll stop there. I'd like to thank you all again for coming, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Master Bhaswati Mukherjee, for bringing alive the horrors that were faced by the Indian indentured labor, and also putting into context their indomitable spirit through which they retained their identity and now are really a part of their own countries and making a difference there. With these words, may I now request Ambassador Amitava Tripathi to make his remarks. He is the former Ambassador of India to Switzerland, and he was the former Ambassador of India to Brazil. Ambassador.
Am I audible? Am I audible? All right? Okay, thank you. Even without the mic, I thought so. नहीं ठीक है कोई प्रॉब्लम है निकालना है बहुत ऊंचा हो गया अच्छा निकाल दीजिए कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं more visible the better.
The stool is meant for me and even Veena doesn't need.
Well, dear friends, I am really, truly honored to be present here today as a panelist in this remarkable book by my young, she's still very young compared to me, colleague, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee. We go back a very, very long time. In fact, when she was doing her first posting abroad in Paris, I landed up there as the head of Chancery. And we struck up a wonderful friendship. Not only that, she could speak French very fluently even then, and she must have mastered it even further, given her career profile. But she was also a very good Bengali cook. You see, so this is something that immediately bonded us. And I am very, very grateful to Bhaswati for keeping up this friendship and even adding to it over the years. So no wonder when the offer came to me to be a panelist, I jumped at it. But that is not all that binds us together. We are all both students of history. And we have studied the Western civilization in particular with great care. A lot of admiration, but a lot of horror. Some of the worst things that have happened to mankind since the beginnings of time, slavery, the Holocaust, the dropping of the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what is happening today in Gaza. These are some of the great contributions of Western civilization to mankind. And it is in this framework that the unbearable cruelty and humiliation, and in Bhaswati's word, deracination of the poor Indian farmers, migrants, landless laborers, and so on and so forth, mostly from eastern UP and Bihar, that took place just after the end of slavery in 1733, and 1833, and went on till the early decades of the 20th century, make us pause as to what kind of a great civilization is this that can treat anybody who is a non-white, whether he's black or brown or yellow, should be treated in this subhuman fashion. Now, you have heard a little bit about Bhaswati's approach to this very important topic, which has for so long been ignored, even in the country of the origin of this indentured labor, and for which she needs to be congratulated again and again, that she has given voice to these poor, miserable people taken to alien lands under false pretexts, false premises, agreements which they could not even pronounce and called girmitya. And worse still is, of course, of the women among them. I don't want to go into it. We have 3 women panelists out of 5. That clearly shows the preponderance of feminism in modern India, and we are proud of it. We are proud of it. But let me be very clear that the intense suffering the Indians suffered during these 100+ years abroad, largely brought about by their foreign employers, with the connivance of the foreign governments, the colonial governments that ruled over us in those days, but also with the active collaboration of Indians, for God's sake. What were the zamindars of this period who benefited, the fat cats, from the permanent settlement of Lord Cornwallis? What were the banyas, the moneylenders, and the darogas, the all-powerful darogas doing? They were fully and freely collaborating with the British colonists to exploit their own countrymen. At the height of the British rule in India, there were 60,000 British soldiers and 40,000 civilians, another 60 to 70,000 family members. Less than 200,000 people ruled over 300 million Indians of that day. Is it possible that this could be done without the active collaboration of Indians? Absolutely not. And who were the Arkatis? The Arkatis who drummed up these people, destroyed because they had no land, they had no capital, they had no education, their skills were very limited. What would they do but to look desperately for jobs? Today you find Indians fighting in Russia against Ukraine. For God's sake, we find Indians in Israel fighting against the Palestinians. What has changed? The poor in India have always been in this extremely vulnerable position. Because forget about the foreign hand, that's always been there. But what about the Indian hand? What did we do to help them out? It's very interesting. And one question, this is, of course, I put to Ambassador Mukherjee. She was very qualified to answer that. Most of these people were shipped out from Calcutta, which was the most developed port of the time and the capital of British India. Hardly any Bengalis. There were people from UP, people from Bihar, people from Jharkhand, even people from Orissa. Why no Bengalis? It's a very interesting question one asks because they too.
Do you know the answer?
No, they were not all like me. Most of them were very, very poor, but they didn't go. Anyway, the fact of the matter is they were probably somewhat better educated, closer to the capital of British India, a little more aware of their identity, so therefore they could resist the temptations, the lies, the prevarications that were sort of used, freely used, by the people who were drumming them up and kind of ramrodding them and taking them to the ports and putting them on the very ships which used to carry slaves once upon a time. Now I would like to put things in a little context. We have heard a lot about the indentured labor, but how did all this begin? All this began at the height of the high Renaissance. That was the time when very adventurous British traders, merchants, bankers, sailors realized that if you are going to make money, real money, not small beer, you have to reach the east. How do you reach the east? In 1453, Constantinople had fallen to Sultan Mahmud II's guns. The Levant was controlled by the Turks. Anything you wanted to do, you pay tax through your nose. You have to find routes out to the east, one way or the other. The Spaniards and, of course, their cousins, the Portuguese, were the ones who were the pioneers in this. And in this, Christopher Columbus, a very smart Genoese sailor, somehow went and hoodwinked Isabel and Ferdinand of Spain. Please finance my project, and I shall find a way to the east through the west. His calculations went haywire. He landed in Bahamas. He promptly declared this was India. He has reached Indies, and these people were Indians. And now I'll tell you what he did after that. This is something which is not so well known. The people he made there, the local Indians, the local people, I shouldn't call them Indians, indigenous people, were the Arawaks and Taino. The very next day after landing in Bahamas, this is what he wrote in his diary. They ought to make good and skilled servants, since they repeat very quickly whatever we say to them. I think they can very easily be made Christians, for they seem to have no religion. I will take 6 of them when I leave, so that they may learn our language. With 50 men, you could subject everyone and make them do what you wished. Prophetic words. Second day after landing in Bahamas, this is how he read the future of the world. And not in exactly the words that Columbus wrote, but in much the same way, whether it was Cortes, Hernando Cortes against the Aztecs, or Francis Pizarro against the Incas. They just destroyed civilization, just like that. They didn't give a second thought. But they found that the native Indians were not really very good used to hard work. And after having looted and plundered the New World of gold, silver, or whatever they could lay their hands on, they struck upon a wealth which was simply unimaginable, untold, and renewable. And what were these? Sugar, first and foremost, and also corn and tobacco and other items too. Of course, Vasco da Gama, the other bright boy after Christopher Columbus, took a trip around the Cape of Good Hope and landed up in Calicut one day. And here too, the same practice. We have ships, we have guns, we have compasses, we have astrolabes. These guys have nothing. We can terrorize them, the coastal areas. As long as the great Mughals were able to take care of India, it was okay. They got thrashed many times, the Portuguese, the British, the Dutch. They had all got thrashing from Indians, till which time we were a united country. There was no concept of nation. It was all dynastic. But we were a united people. But what happened was, after Aurangzeb, the Mughal empire started crumbling. They were not able to produce good leaders. The later Mughals were one disaster after another. And they were attacked from outside with the Afghans. Internally, they had problems with the Marathas. And the visiting companies, the East India Company foremost among them, took advantage of this chaos, absolute chaos within the country, to expand their power and influence. It is very interesting to note
Ambassador
that,
Tripathi.
yes, please. Am I
wait.
gone beyond? Sorry.
No, another 2 minutes, then we can run.
Okay. So it is in this context we have to understand. If you have read the work of Dalrymple on the East India Company, anarchy, the conduct of anarchy that was practiced, it is not at all surprising that these poor people of Eastern UP and Bihar will fall prey to the kind of machinations that the planters in Mauritius, in Fiji, in Suriname and Guyana, etc. wanted. So this is a very important story, needs to be told, and I'm very happy that Ambassador Mukherjee has taken the trouble and the pains to write a very well written, very well documented book on this. But what I liked most of all are that she has the heart of a poet, besides being a researcher. The book is interspersed with beautiful and very apt poem pieces from T.S. Eliot and even from reputed indentured laborers who are descendants of indentured laborers. With this, I conclude, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions if you wish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Tripathi, for bringing a huge new perspective into how the colonists thought about looking at the lands they were going to and how the dynamics of the internal dynamics of the countries they reached out to. May I now request Ambassador Veena Sikri, former High Commissioner of India to Bangladesh and to Malaysia, to give her remarks.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh for inviting me to be a panelist. I'd like to congratulate Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee for this excellent book she's written. I really enjoyed reading it. It's very moving. It brings out the real pathos, the pathetic situation of the indentured labor and also the condition of the women there. But how the Indian spirit, the indomitable Indian spirit allowed them and through the commitment to their Indianness, they were able to survive and keep their Indian culture intact and recall their deep connections to India, whether it's through culture, religion, language, and literature. And it's really very fascinating to see how Bhaswati has brought about this, has narrated this this very, very moving story. I'd like to actually also compare this, what Bhaswati has written, with what was the reality of the Indian indentured labor that went to the east, to Malaya, then Malaya, now Malaysia. And actually, it's really sad to see how even when you talk about the pathetic conditions of the people who went to Mauritius and Fiji, the condition of the Indians who were forced to go to Malaya was much, much worse. And this at a point when you see that it is because of the Indian indentured labor who went to Malaya that the Second World War was won, that the industrialization of Britain took place. And let me explain how, through rubber. Because right till the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, even, I would say even late 19th century, the sole availability of rubber was through jungle rubber, which you had to go into the jungle and look for the rubber plant and then pluck the rubber and make. But when, after 1876, when the British came to Penang, took over Penang, and then after that took over all of Malaysia, then a few decades after that, they brought a rubber sapling to Malaya from the Latin American jungles where it used to grow. And they planted it. And soon, from zero production of rubber, within a few decades, well before the Second World War, they had half the world's rubber production was taking place in Malaya. But it was done at the price of the life of the Indian indentured labor who came there, in the millions, because the total migration of Indians to Malaya between 1876, when British went to Penang, and this is, I'm talking about the post-British migration, because there was a much earlier migration on trade, which I will not go into. And 4.25 million people went from India to Malaya between 1876 and 1957, which was the year of Malaya's independence. More than 65% of them were indentured labor, who received wages much lower than what Bhaswati has written about in her book. You know, you've written about a shilling and maybe and then 9 pennies for the women. Here, it was like 5 rupees a month, you know, and they had to pay the cost of the passage. So it was absolutely cruel, and I would like to hear not only highlight the conditions of the labor which are written about, but I want to say how the people in India reacted to it. I think Bhaswati has brought this out very well in her book when she talked about Mahatma Gandhi's reaction and how they made a big issue of it. But with Malaya, it was an amazing struggle to make sure that the constitution of Malaya, which ultimately got independence in 1957, would allow equality of all citizens. And this was there in the other countries at the time when they got the independence. So we have the place that, people of Indian origin have risen to the post of Prime Minister and are doing so well now after having gone through the indentured labor. But unlike in India, where the constitution assures respect for the minorities, the Malaysian constitution did not do any of all this. And I remember that at that time, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was so concerned about it that he made many trips to Malaysia to talk to the British and with the first Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tunku Abdul Rahman. But ultimately, only because there were these political parties formed, one for the Chinese, one for the Indians, one for the Malays, and they decided to have a coalition so that we agreed to the constitution. And that's not the end of it. While I was there as High Commissioner in Malaysia, the HINRAF, the Hindu Rights Action Front, has filed a case in the British courts asking for a compensation of 1 million for each of the 1.8 million indentured labor taken to Malaya. And saying the British government was responsible not only for their treatment, not only for giving them such poor wages, so many of them died, even the condition of saying there must be one woman for every 1.5 male. This is written down in the law, by the way. That was not observed. So they've asked for it. It became a big issue, that was there. And that case is still there. It hasn't been closed, I think. But I think we should hope that it will happen. And I would like to also finally, I know that I have only a few more minutes, also talk about what happened in India after independence. I know that before independence, we had a great deal of concern for indentured labor. And that was a very big concern. I've just mentioned first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru took so much interest in going to Malaya. He didn't want the apartheid system that was there in South Africa and which Mahatma Gandhi had suffered under to be repeated in Malaya. But as we know, the constitution did not give him that satisfaction. But after independence, this interest in indentured labor, in all the people who had left India, in all the people who had, sacrificed their lives, their families, they were forced to leave. Many of them were forced to leave India. They were dragged away from India, literally. But after independence, that concern for this group went down a lot. And we do see that even Prime Minister Nehru himself said that, those citizens who have gone away, now you belong to the citizens of another country, you are children of that country, you will stay with that country. So much so that in a country like Malaya, there were hundreds, in fact in the thousands, in fact maybe even 100,000 people who never got any citizenship because they were in the plantations, away from any kind of habitation, and they had no time to register themselves. They had nobody helped them to register. So even till today, you have stateless citizens who have no state. And there was no interest in looking after them. I would say that only much later, decades later, we do have the first report on overseas Indians that was written. And today, I think in the diaspora, we have a huge interest in integrating the diaspora, making them a bridge of friendship, of development between India and these countries, and making sure that they are part of the Indian development and the Indian story. But can this make up for what generations of Indian indentured labor has gone through? It's very difficult, but I think we have to do our best to keep that memory alive, to say what a colonial power, to highlight what a colonial power could do to other fellow citizens, and how could they be treated, how could they be humiliated in every single way, treated as less than human beings. I think this memory should not go away. I'd like to once again thank Bhaswati for bringing out this wonderful book, and thank you, Vijay, for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sikri. You have really drawn our attention eastwards, east of India, to what was happening in Malay. And you have, of course, touched on downstream issues which were faced by those people, like the state of statelessness. And then, of course, the very important issue of reparations. which still is an open issue. It hasn't been addressed. So thank you for your remarks. With this, may I request Ambassador Skand Tayal, former Ambassador of India to the Republic of Korea and Uzbekistan, to make his remarks.
Good evening. I join Director General Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh and my senior colleagues, Ambassador Amitava Tripathi and Ambassador Veena Sikri, in congratulating Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee for writing this book. Bhaswati is not only a batchmate, but a close friend and a bridge partner. And really a book makes very poignant reading. And Bhaswati has managed to throw light on a dark chapter of Indian history, colonial history, which was full of exploitation, injustice, cruelty. A poignant story of more than 2 million indentured, going from 1838 to 1917 to 26 countries, and their travels and travails and toil, and how they were lured, enticed, cheated in signing the agreements. But there is a context, as Ambassador Tripathi said. There was poverty and famine in eastern India at that time, and that was a direct result of exploitative colonial practices, the permanent settlement and Lord Cornwallis's brainchild, and which and its consequences have been chronicled again by Ambassador Mukherjee in her first book, Bengal and its Partition. But it's really heartwarming to see how this sort of not lost, but in some ways lost, children of India preserved their culture, their identity, their language, and their religion. My first exposure to Pravasi Bhartiyas or descendants of indentured was when I visited Mauritius in 1982 as a young under-secretary. And it was a Tuesday. And in the evening, I saw that every temple there was Ramcharitmanas going on, and Hanuman Chalisa, and people singing with a lot of energy, and from temple they were overflowing onto the roads. And that was something which one has really not seen in India itself. And that came as a very, very pleasant surprise. Because to Mauritius and perhaps Fiji, families had moved. And as has been very clearly said, the women were really the custodians of culture, identity, practices, customs. And the role of faith in keeping their hope alive, keeping their optimism alive, keeping them sane. And on page 134, Bhaswati says, and I quote, Valmiki Ramayana was ever present and carried by the indentured wherever they went. Muslims carried their family Quran, unquote. The book also throws the spotlight on the role and sufferings of the indentured women. But that raises troubling questions. What prompted single women from India to go abroad to absolutely unknown lands? Were they escaping from exploitation in their own families, by the society? Maybe young widows. The author mentioned some prostitutes were also sent, but it's a very troubling part of any book of history raises questions which merit further inquiry. So were the social practices of at that time so oppressive for some women that they had to escape. Then, of course, it highlights the resistance by women against exploitation in 1920s. In Mauritius, some Indian women's committees organized strikes, and one strike, some lady, I think, sacrificed her life. And that reminded me of my second exposure to Indentured was when I was posted as Consul General in Johannesburg, in Durban area. In Natal, the Indentured had come, more than 20,000. And but this young girl called Valiamma was a young associate of Mahatma Gandhi, and she took part in a march in Transvaal, was arrested, 16-year-old, was very unwell, and as soon as she came out of the jail, she passed away. And there is a memorial for her in Bramfontein Cemetery in Johannesburg. So girls, women have played a role, a very important role in this resistance. Then Mr. Mukherjee also mentions the Indian-African / Creole divide. And that has been there from that time, and perhaps still continues to be strong in countries like South Africa. And one reason was that the people of Indian origin, Indian indentured, they invested in education of their children. As soon as the indentured thing was abolished in 1916, in South Africa it was said that the parents missed lunch. They did not eat, but sent their children to paid fees that they go to school. And to quote the author, the conflict and hostility between the newly freed indentured and the original inhabitants or the freed slaves was unfortunate but inevitable. There were deep social and cultural prejudices bordering on racism, unquote, and unfortunately this feeling of racism was on both sides, both on the Indian side and the African side. Well, anecdotally, but I was told that many Indians were members of African National Congress. But even when at that time in 50s or 60s, even if Nelson Mandela came to an Indian's house, he sat in the veranda. He was not asked to come inside. Well, but again, talking of South Africa, Natal, 20,000 Indians went as indentured labor since 1860, initially in sugar plantation, but very quickly they moved to work in the railway and industry. And the racial divide fostered by the apartheid continues in the sense that 2012, the average household income in South Africa of whites is $42,000, of Indians is $27,000, and of Africans is $7,000. So Africans harbor a resentment against Indians. And of course, Indians say that earlier we were not white enough, and now we are not black enough. But another very interesting point which I captured from the book was that since 1910 or so, there was active opposition to indentured in India. But the motivations were different. Marwadis of Calcutta were opposed because they were not getting cheap labor, which was going as indentured. And the priest, C.F. Andrews, who used to teach in St. Stephen's College here, he opposed because he had a sense of compassion and humanity, etc.
C.F. Andrews.
Sorry, C.F. Andrews. And on page 153, I would like to quote what Ambassador Mukherjee writes. Gokhale and Gandhi highlighted the coercive and fraudulent aspects of the system and its racist and demeaning undertones in treating Indians as coolies. Malviya also expressed concern at the lack of support to safeguard and preserve the religion of the indentured. Mark the difference. But Madan Mohan Malviya is focused on religion, whereas Gandhi and Gokhale are focused on economic exploitation. Interesting points. But all of that is, of course, part of history, and if we come to today, because one should learn from history, it raises some troubling questions. Was indentured a form of bonded labor? And bonded labor still continues in India, unfortunately. The returnees, some of them who came from Mauritius and Fiji, they went back because the conditions in India were worse. Another troubling question is, are the descendants of the original indentured better off than people who were in their own villages and who remained in India? Fiji, the per capita income is $5,500, and the Indians' per capita income will certainly be higher than this because they are the richer people. Mauritius, it is $10,000. India, it is $2,500. And in Bihar and eastern UP, from where most of the indentured went, it would be even less. So is India condemned to be a provider of cheap labor to the world? Last 200 years we have been doing it. 8 million people in the Gulf, we read how they are treated in Qatar and Kuwait, etc. Dunki film, many of you would have seen. Ambassador Mukherjee talked about our fellows are going to die in Israel, in Ukraine. So what is this demographic dividend? It's a fantasy. We are staring at demographic disaster. Estimates are that our population will be 1.7 billion by 2060s. 1.7 billion. Anyway, but the only plus part is that it's a confident India, a resurgent India, a very positive outlook India, so we can look after our people who are abroad, perhaps better than what it was 200 years ago. I'll end by again complimenting Ambassador Mukherjee in what she spoke in Vilnius, and with passion, and always we see it every day in everything what she does, with full commitment, with full passion, with full energy. And she was very active when she was ambassador to UNESCO. The present Korean ambassador here, Ambassador Chang Ji-bok, was deputy PR at UNESCO when ambassador was there. Ambassador Mukherjee was there. And he says that whenever Ambassador Mukherjee spoke, all listened very carefully, and the secretariat was terrified of her. So on that happy note, thank you very much, and compliments once again, Bhaswati, for writing this book.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Tayal. And of course, he focused on the women, troubling questions, and the different arguments against indentured labor within India. So a number of questions have been asked. So what we do is we'll ask Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee to answer some of the questions that have been raised by the parliamentarians, and then we'll open the floor. 2 questions from the audience. Ambassador Bhaswati.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh, and all my friends and co-panelists, especially my dear batchmate, Ambassador Skand Tayal, for his last anecdote. There were 3 questions asked, basically. Ambassador Amitava Tripathi wanted to know why, although initially 1.5 million Indians were shipped out from Kolkata port, how come there were no Bengalis? Actually, Ambassador Tripathi knows the answer to that question, but I'll answer it all the same. The response is that the permanent settlement imposed upon India by the then Viceroy resulted in the total impoverishment of the small farmer who became landless. The subsequent injunction that they are not allowed to grow food crops for their own family, and the order to cultivate opium and sell it at a very low price so as to enslave a whole generation of Chinese and to enrich the mother country, resulted for the first time ever in a part of India that was known to be green and fertile, to bring a devastating famine after famine, where there were Bengalis who came, but they were not the Bhadralok, naturally, and I'm not a Bhadralok either. I can't speak for Ambassador Tripathi. But I'm not a Bhadralok. The Bhadraloks, naturally, were the collaborators, and so they didn't need to go on the slave ships without chains. There were many, many highly impoverished Bengalis, Biharis, Jharkhandis, Eastern UPites, who were lured into Kolkata by the Arkatias, which is the recruiter, Indian recruiter, who played the same role as the Oswald Jains played in the Battle of Plassey, when we talk about Siraj's head being cut off by his cousin, Mir Jafar, and that's why in Bengal we never call anyone Mir Jafar. But the point is, who funded Mir Jafar? It was the Oswald Jains. So there were Indian collaborators all the way from Plassey till independence. And that's a fact that we cannot deny, which I have not written in this book, but which I will cover in my next book. The point here is, when they were shipped out, there were alarming stories that there were not enough women. So the colonial government then made an injunction that for every 5 men, there should be 2 women. Which brings me to the second question as to why single women went. Single women went for various reasons. Some were common to the men. There was famine, there was destitution. There was no employment. Some were kidnapped from their homes, I've written about it. Some were lured by the Arkatias. Some went to join their husbands who had gone earlier and had disappeared. And some intrepid women, after all, if you have 3 intrepid women on the panel, they must be descended from intrepid mothers and grandmothers. So there were intrepid women, even in that time and age, who decided to make the journey to make a better future and money to eat. So it was not that single women, every single woman was a prostitute, because what the Victorian historian wrote, and which the Indian male chauvinist accepted, is that the women who went were all prostitutes and of loose moral values. That is not true. It was said that all the brothels of Kolkata were emptied out so that these prostitutes could be put on the ships, told to keep their mouth shut about their future and go and make a new life for themselves. That is also a very unfortunate lie about the role of indentured women. Then there was this whole question of the India-Africa Creole divide. I'd like to make a point here. There's less of a divide in places where there is a Creolish kind of civilization. So I talk about Guyana, I talk about Mauritius. There the Creole, what they've done is, they have made friends with the freed black slave. On the back of the freed black slave, whom they had in the first instance put against the Indian, they have tried to come to power or maintain political parties. That is certainly true in Mauritius, where there are 2 Indian parties, one which is not supported by the Creoles and one which is supported by the Creoles. That is also true all over the Caribbean. The only place where there was an exception, because there was a large black indigenous population there when the Indian indentured were brought by the British, that is Fiji. And in Fiji, in fact, it is very unfortunate that both sides practiced racism, and it is true that many of the Indian indentured put their children through school and university, so they got better paid jobs. The better they did, the worse became the social situation. So as I said, when you come back to it, wherever they went, they divided, they ruled, they partitioned. Wherever they went, they practiced the racinement. Wherever they went, they turned the black against the brown. They turned the black against the Chinese. They turned the brown against the Chinese. And why did they do that? Because they wanted to rule forever. It is a misnomer to think that they went willingly in 1947. They went because the situation was out of control. So they beat a precipitate retreat without ensuring law and order, without ensuring an orderly partition. They've done that all over Africa. And now you see the same thing happening when the Americans left Afghanistan with only their shoes on. Same thing has happened everywhere. They left Vietnam when they couldn't control it. So they did all this, dividing us against the blacks because they wanted to rule forever. And what has happened today, for instance, in Fiji, people ask me, and I've been to Fiji with Ambassador Vijay, Thakur Singh's predecessor, T.C. Raghavan. He was Director of Finance, I was GSAD, to reopen the Indian embassy there. I found the community of Indians there completely out of contact with the India of today and living in a time capsule, warped time capsule of 150 years ago. And that is also very scary because their perception of India is very, very different from what it is today. And I think it was Skand who mentioned about Nelson Mandela not being allowed into the house of an Indian. That is also true because in 1986, when I went to Zimbabwe for the Non-Aligned Summit, the Indian delegation was divided up into houses, and the houses in Zimbabwe had black servants. And there were huge dogs that used to roam around in the compound at night. And the black servant was never allowed beyond the veranda into the kitchen. But since I had the run of the kitchen for 10 days because Indian men don't know how to cook, I was given the responsibility, apart from negotiating, to also manage to make them eat good food. I'm a good cook. I got those black boys into the kitchen and told them that I come from the land of Gandhi and that they must stay in the kitchen, and after we leave, they must continue to come into the kitchen. As a result of which, when we went back, a letter of complaint against me was sent to the Foreign Minister of India saying that there was somebody called Bhaswati Mukherjee who came and has made such a social revolution there that all those black servants say that they have the right to come into the kitchen and they will come into the kitchen. Well, that was my little bit of contribution. I'm glad I did what I did. I'm happy to take more questions.
Well, the floor is open for questions, so raise your hands. And first, Ambassador Surendra.
Ek mic,
They'll get it.
I am quite near. Actually, I want your permission to seek comment of my friend Amitava. We have, Bhaswati, I have already contributed. Excellent book. You have raised an issue which is really calling for attention for a long, long time. Now, we have talked about this Indian laborers, exploitation by the colonial power, whether Mauritius, whether Malay, whether other countries, whether British colonizers or the Portuguese colonizer whom I have seen in Mozambique, or the French colonizer you see all over. Exploitation was different, but exploitation. This can passingly refer to bonded labor. Now, all these colonizers, they were treating in such humiliating, exploitative manner the persons who were not one of them. They were treating others. Bonded labor, the Indians treating the Indians the way. And not only today, 75 years, unofficial figure, 3.5 million bonded labor. Largely young boys, 8-year-old, 12-year-old, 15-year-old. Legally it is not allowed, but they do exist. And so many governments have come and gone. We talk about these people who did what they did 100 years back. Their successors have now become prime ministers, president of the country. But these bonded laborers and families, they are again going on. You don't have to go to Haryana, hardly 100 kilometers away, brick kilns. Go to Bhadoi on the carpet. You got these millions boys, girls, their future is dark. Governments come, make it even go. How do you really categorize these people? They are not colonizers, the Indians treating Indians that way. Amitava.
I mean, contradictions in a country as vast as India are only to be expected. The truth is, as I see, you see, the land is the most precious commodity or wealth that has been in India for thousands of years. The industrialization is relatively recent, almost post-independence. There are just not enough jobs. Just not enough jobs. That's it. That's the truth. And the land cannot support a population of this size. So there is pure desperation, and there are clever people who take advantage of the helplessness of the landless laborers or maybe tenants, small tenants, people who are indebted, heavily indebted. From their agricultural operations, one crop fails, one famine, one monsoon which goes awry, one drought, and you're finished. One breadwinner dies. You are down, finished. The extent of poverty and misery in India is simply unimaginable. We cannot be in denial of that until you have addressed these fundamental economic issues. Going down to the lowest level of our society, you will have these anomalies. And I can't say the Indians are always very upright. I mean, if you have an advantage over a fellow Indian, you take it. It's as simple as that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador. What I'll do now is I'm going to take 3 or 4 questions. So introduce yourselves. Who is the question directed to? And then we will begin. Okay, you have the floor here. Yeah, they'll introduce themselves, naturally.
Greetings to everyone. I'm Avni Sablok and I'm a research associate at the council. My question is to Mukherjee ma'am. The book sheds light on the often overlooked stories of the indentured women. How did their experience differ from their male counterpart? And are there any particular stories that stand out in recognizing their resilience and contribution? Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question there. Take 3 and then.
Good evening. My name is Himani. I'm research fellow at the council. My question is directed to Ambassador Mukherjee. Ma'am, as you mentioned, you've spoken about the role of history and you are a student of history yourself. Do you also have this reality of deep-rooted imbalances, power imbalances as well as structural inequalities in the international system? So how do you think an understanding of this historical context can contribute to contemporary discussions on global migration policies and the welfare of migrant workers? Also, do you think mainstreaming research on the subject may impact migration narratives in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you. There was a hand here.
My name is Biam. I'm former director of Indian Council of Historical Research. It is not my question. This is just addition to the talks. In fact, slavery was very much present in India, even during the time of Mughals. And this study of slavery by the British scholars, maybe visitors like Buchanan, Hamilton, and others, gave information to the empire that there is a good chance of getting very good labor for our new colonies abroad. In that case, in fact, I'm sorry, this Portuguese and Spanish, they were very much present in Indian Ocean in the 16th century onwards. And Dutch took over slave trade. After the slavery, the new slavery started. That is called indentured. Indentured is new slavery. Of course, they were taken with agreement. Even before agreement, in 1830s, a lot of slaves were taken to West Indies, from Mauritius, and also from South Africa. So my just question is, why can't we hold responsible to the indigenous social structure and economic structure of the society? How feudal society, in fact, gave this type of situation for indentured labor abroad.
Thank
This is
you.
very important.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll take one more question and then I'll request Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee to respond and each of the panelists to make their final remarks. There's a hand there.
Dr. Puneet here. I'm a fellow at the council. And first of all, I would like to thank you, ma'am, for the subject on this indenture and their root, especially the correlation with the quest for identity at the time when we are fulfilling our interest with multiple identities. That is one of the very important theme in that particular time. My question is based on the subject Veena ma'am touched upon in her remarks. Has there been significant research on those indentured laborers who managed to return to India following the First World War? You discussed about World War II. What findings, if yes, then what findings have emerged regarding their integration, reintegration, and contribution back home? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Vijay Thakur Singh. The first question, which was with regard to indentured women, I would suggest that you, if you haven't bought the book, to get a copy outside, because there is a whole section, chapter-wise, on indentured women, on the kind of inhuman treatment different from men that they were subjected to, including when they were pregnant, when they were given no maternity leave, when they had delivered the child, they were expected to come back the very next day and work in the plantation. They were not allowed to leave the newborn child with another woman, and they were given much lower wages, and they were expected to run the home, look after the child, do the cooking, and in many cases be raped by the white overseer, in addition to their many, many other burdens, including complete absence of any access to health facilities for women, etc. So it's a very sad story, and I have described it in detail, and I have received many, many suggestions that in my next book, which is going to be The Journey of the Indian Women, I should include 2-3 more chapters on indentured women, because the publisher had put a limit of 50,000 words, and so I was not able to completely narrate the full history of indentured women, which I intend to do. The other question was about whether there should be mainstream research on this issue. I would go much further than that. I would say that just as the story of the Bengal partition is not known to anyone in India outside Bengal, and in the north we only speak of the Punjab partition. All the museums earlier were only about the Punjab partition. I wrote about the Bengal partition because in many ways it mirrored the tragedy of the Punjab partition, because in Bengal there was a syncretic culture that was destroyed by the poisoned grapes of communalism planted by the British. Similarly, for indenture, I realized that there is a complete paucity, absence of knowledge of these people, what happened to them, how they were treated, what they've done of themselves, and how they now contribute to the prosperity of India. And that's a story I thought that was worth telling. Then there was I wanted to add that apart from how Indians treat Indians, which is a separate story altogether, which Ambassador Surendra Kumar raised, I want to underline that the colonizers never apologized for slavery because they were afraid to pay reparations. The colonizers never apologized for indenture. And the colonizers never returned the looted heritage from different countries, including India. I would like to suggest to all of you, when you go to Mauritius next time, Mauritius is the only country that has 2 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. One is Apravasi Ghat, that I have talked about, but the other, which I can never forget, is called Le Morne. Le Morne is a World Heritage Site dedicated to Africa's lost slaves. It is on the top of a high cliff overlooking the ocean. Once you climb that cliff, there is no way out except to commit suicide by jumping into the ocean. And slave after slave after slave jumped off that cliff in the direction of Madagascar, where he came from, because he preferred death to slavery. Just below the cliff, there are, and I've talked about it in my book, there are some very beautiful statues and masterpieces that have been put there to depict the suffering of the slave, including one of an African man in his native attire, seated in the ground, hands like together, showing resistance. And that is something we should not forget, that Mauritius had a horrific history, first of slavery and then of indenture. And it is a country that, unlike others, has been able to coexist with the descendants of both. And there, in many ways, therefore, Mauritius is an example of a way forward for the other rainbow nations, including South Africa or Zimbabwe, where I told you the story. I never even knew that such things happened until I went to Zimbabwe as a young deputy secretary and saw for myself the kind of racism that Indians practice against blacks. But these kind of stories need to be disseminated so that the new generation do not perpetuate the same tragic history century after century after century.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee. Now for the final comments, may I request Ambassador Amitava Tripathi to make his final comments.
Thank you. I think Ambassador Mukherjee has said everything that had to be said about this very excellent book. Undeniably, it has been done with a lot of very serious research and written with a lot of passion. And this is a tremendous combination, the heart and the mind, which got together to produce a book of this type. Now, as my dear friend Sunindra Kumar had rightly pointed out, unless there are flaws in the society which is being exploited, unless there are collaborators within the same society, this kind of exploitation is not possible. I have not had much to do with the indentured labor, but I had some idea of the impact of slavery when I was posted as ambassador to Brazil. It is very interesting. The northern part of Brazil is subtropical, it's hot, it's humid. What do they grow there? Sugar. Who grows that sugar? Blacks. Come down to the south, it's temperate, cool. Who are the people slaving there? Italians and Germans. What do they grow? Coffee. Either blacks grow something that is white, and the whites grow something that is black. You see, it's all economics. The blacks can put up with those horrible weather conditions as Indians can. Whites can't. But they control power, they control political power, economic power. So there is no point in saying that, oh my God, these people have exploited us, they're horrible people. Of course they're horrible people. But you have allowed them to be horrible. The fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Tripathi. I give the floor to Ambassador Veena Sikri.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those comments. You asked about the return of indentured labor. I'd like to say very much that there's really very little evidence that any of the indentured labor ever went back because first of all, the control of shipping. There was no means of transportation, and the ships which took them were controlled entirely by the British. The Indian shipping industry had been entirely finished off by that time, so only the British ships and some other European ships were used at that time. And then, of course, there was so much poverty among them, so there was no choice of them wanting to go back. The third, they would have also have thought that what kind of a welcome would await them back in India. So I think that the narrative of why they were sent was very different from what it was, because I think we must remember when we were debating about whether Bengalis were sent or not, that the British planned very carefully who would go where. I've been through the documents while working on my book on Malaysia, where I've seen how they discussed who should go as indentured labor to Malaya. And they said, no, it cannot be the North Indians because they're going as policemen and they're going as security officers. And it cannot be, we don't want to send these Biharis because they've gone off to the other places like Mauritius and so on. And so they decided and actually passed a law that it can only be people from South India who will go to Malaya. It was actually, ordained like that. So it was absolutely cruel down to the last limit. So I don't think there was any idea. I think that what we have to learn from these debates and these books is that we must get the British to apologize. That is the very minimum. The reparation of 1 million per person is something that has been asked for. Let's see what happens to that case. But why can't we ask the British to apologize?
Let's grab hold of Suna.
No, and you know, we've known, for example, let me give you an example. Very recently, I think a week or 10 days ago, Yale University in the US extended an apology because this name of the person, Elihu Yale, who founded that university, he made his money in India.
Yes.
And he was known to be very corrupt and known to have made a lot of illegal money, particularly from slavery and particularly from indentured labor, money out of that. So then ultimately they've apologized. So we have to work towards that. There's no point debating. We've got to get the British to come down and accept what they've done wrong. This is what we have to work for. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And now Ambassador Skand Tayal.
I think apology by the British would be a very good start. Reparations, of course, are perhaps not possible, but no people should be forgotten, and this book should be a starting point for more research in not only in India but in all the 28 countries where the Indentured went. So we look forward to your next book. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this panel today, I think in ICW, today the book discussion has actually brought a subject on the table in which we need to do much more research. And because now we are doing work on migration, international migration, the diaspora, I think this discussion has been very relevant to our scholars, some of who are present here and have worked on those subjects. It also means that, you know, time is connected. You know, history cannot be separated from the contemporary. Some of the historical questions have yet to be kind of closed, particularly the reparation and the apologies, and actually to see the lives of people. Those who were successful also, we rejoice, but there are points which have not really been taken care of. So on that note, may I thank all the panelists and to say that Ambassador Bhaswati, your book is seminal in terms of studies on migration. Thank you, Ambassador.
I would like to express my gratitude to Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee for kindly agreeing to have a discussion on her book at Sapru House, and to her invaluable contribution to migration studies and diaspora studies through the book. Special gratitude to today's panelists, Ambassador Amitava Tripathi, Ambassador Veena Sikri, and Ambassador Skand Tayal for their enriching contribution. I would like to thank the audience for the engaging participation. I now invite everyone for high tea in the foyer. Thank you.